So everybody, welcome back to another episode of Crude Talk. I'm Justin Vandenbrink, Director of Strategic Sales here at Premier Oilfield Group. Today, super excited. We have Moji Karimi. He is the CEO of Cemvita Factory. And I just asked you that. Sometimes I knew you as Cemvita, and you're like, no, it's a factory now, right?
Yes.
So we are going to talk today. I'm just going to generally say to our group so they know what we're going to talk about, and then you can clarify my comments. But what I say to people when I talk about you, and we've known each other for a while, I say Moji is bringing a little bit of the biology to the energy industry and mixing biology with geology subsurface to come up with new and innovative ways for our energy industry to prosper and be successful. And maybe you can just give us an overview of Cemvita and how you got there, and then we can talk about some fun stuff that you're working on.
Yeah, I'll be happy to, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So Cemvita, kind of the genesis story was, in my last startup experience, I was at a company where we're looking at DNA of microbes in the subsurface and realizing what a thriving community of microbes are there. But I started thinking about how could we use this, in a functional way. And when we got to kind of start in Cemvita, the reaction that we were really excited about at the beginning was photosynthesis reaction, because that's one example where in nature we could start from CO2 and convert that into chemicals, right? So remember from high school, CO2, water to glucose and oxygen, right?
Right.
And the question was, can humans do that? Because on one hand, we have this problem with CO2, and we have this example where it's happening in nature. Can we humans build systems that could convert CO2 into chemicals? And so that's what we did. And we converted CO2 to glucose initially. Mm-hmm. The first application that we found for that actually was for deep space exploration, converting the CO2 that astronauts breathe out into glucose, which then they could use as a calorie source, kind of building a regenerative life support system. And there's vehicles that go into this deep space. And then way down the road on Mars, because 96% of the air is CO2, mm-hmm. you could use that as a carbon source. So it started in Mars and deep space. Then we said, okay, that's great, but that's a small kind of market. What if we could make other chemicals from CO2? And that's where we expanded kind of the pathways into going to intermediate chemicals that are used in making polymers and plastics. So we started working on the bioethylene, for example, mm-hmm. conversion of CO2 to bioethylene. And so that's our kind of downstream market, using emissions as a starting point, not just as a waste or a liability. Now, so we came from a space to surface. Now let's go to subsurface, right?
Right. And also you went from space to downstream, and now you're saying let's go upstream.
Right. Let's go upstream. Exactly. And what that means is, we're building the systems that on surface, basically we have a bioreactor, very similar to, say, a brewery, mm-hmm. where you have, yeast and microbes, and you feed them sugar and they make, beer or alcohol. And then we also know that we have in the bioethanol industry, biofuel industry, where they start from corn, right? Or like in Brazil from sugar. And through fermentation, they make biofuels. So the idea here was, what if instead of having that bioreactor on surface, we could use the reservoir as the place to do these reactions? So taking a lot of these biochemical learnings into the subsurface and leveraging both the legacy and all the assets that already are there, but also bring in this new element of understanding of the geomicrobiology of the subsurface and what are the microbes that could help us, not just to be a problem for us. Because as you know, in the oil and gas industry, they say the good microbe is a dead microbe, right? Because we worry about H2S and corrosion. But what we're saying here is like there are a lot of microbes there also that could work to our advantage.
So let me stop you on that, because you said something that was very interesting. You said you're kind of taking what's already existing in the oil and gas industry and kind of looking at it from a different angle and turning maybe a negative into a positive. And I think what we're talking about while you're saying that, what made me think about this is carbon capture and sequestration. So CCNS is a big issue right now, and it's starting to take hold in the industry, and it's a buzzword right now. But a lot of big companies, the Exxons, the Oxys, the BHPs, and everybody and their aunt are realizing that you can somewhat reverse the processes of extraction of oil and gas by injecting gas back into those depleted reservoirs. So this is where you come in, because at that stage, you can help with the injection of gas like CO2. And that's what people are wanting to do. They're wanting to store it in the reservoir, right?
That's right. Yeah. And so that's where it starts, right? With CO2 sequestration. The next step is CO2 EOR, right? Like not just to
so
store
let's
the gas.
for people who might not know, EOR is
Enhanced oil recovery.
right. So we got to make sure acronyms, we know this,
Sure.
but not everybody does. So
Yes. Yeah. So the idea there is like to use the CO2 to kind of push more oil out, change the miscibility of the oil, as kind of injection gas. The same thing with water flooding, to pressurize the reservoir. But in this case, if you could use CO2, that's great, because this was something that you were trying to kind of get rid of, and you could have a utilization for it for CO2 EOR.
Yeah.
That's a good pathway. So
Yeah.
that's why there's a differentiation. You mentioned CCNS, right? Carbon capture and storage.
yeah, or
but
sequestration, same thing. It's
sequestration
S,
or storage. And then there is another variation of that is CCUS, which is carbon capture, utilization, and storage.
And you're
or
the U
sequestration.
in this whole
We're
equation.
the U. And actually, I believe strongly, without the U, it's going to be hard to build long-term sustainable solutions. Because when you store CO2, you're not making money, you're spending money to do that. Of course, there's tax benefits, tax credits, but in the long run, we believe in, providing economical pathways that also solve environmental problems.
Right. So let's talk a bit about that, because when I Premier, we have a carbon capture and storage team. We have a lot of experts in the field that are helping our clients deal with that. In the same way that you're taking the U, we're taking the S. Now, to say that injecting into a reservoir and understanding there's a cap rock and keeping the carbon dioxide in there, I mean, it can happen. That is one way to kind of get the carbon out of above surface, below surface. But then what you're saying is, in that workflow or that money flow, why just keep it stored? Why not do something with it and actually make it a moneymaker as well?
Exactly. Yes. So when you guys look into what is the right type of geology to store the CO2, how to ensure kind of the viability of the project,
Yeah.
And all that study, what we're saying is there is an added element which is unlocked by understanding the biology of the reservoir and seeing, hey, these microbes are already there. Can some of them help us to maybe use more CO2 in the subsurface, and also to actually produce chemicals that we're interested in? You could produce fuels, fossil fuels, with this method in the subsurface. You could go to a reservoir where it's about to be plugged and abandoned and bring it back to life, turn it into a storage facility initially, but then by addition of, or using these microorganisms, produce chemicals that then you could kind of, actually produce and sell. So that adds the business model to it.
And so the chemicals that the chemical reactions when you inject CO2 down, you said that you can create what from using your microbes?
Yeah, so there's a category that you could do, right? Because these microorganisms it's like a platform, and there's different types. For example, there is a category of microorganisms called methanogens, and they produce methane. There are other microorganisms that produce hydrogen. There are others that produce longer chain hydrocarbons. So we start off by understanding what is the inherent microbiology of the reservoir. And this is very simple. You just take samples and look at the microbes, right? And then we say, okay, within these microbes, are there some that could help us? It could be as simple as producing biosurfactant, which by itself is going to help with the recovery process. But we could go a step beyond that and say, okay, are there some in here that we could enhance genetically to produce more of the chemical that we're interested in? Because if you think about it, we're already doing this on surface with biofuel industry, but we're just building tanks and do the reaction inside the tank. What I'm saying, why not use the pore space in the reservoir?
And why not use nature's lab?
Right. It's exactly it's a subsurface nature lab. This is how oil was produced in the first place throughout millions of years. But now we have the tools from synthetic biology and bioengineering, CRISPR methods like that to accelerate this process.
So accelerate is a loose term. How much time could you save, and would it be in a generational span? Oil took a long time to be created using nature's way.
Right.
How much is it actually economical what you do to speed up the process?
Yes. Yeah. So we're talking about a span of it could be 1 year, it could be 4, 5 years, but we're not talking about 100 years.
Okay.
And that's what synthetic biology enables. And it's actually not complicated to understand because, you guys have very complicated, sophisticated core laboratories, right? That you could do all these tests and simulate the subsurface. And all this could be done initially on surface to understand both the metrics that we're interested in, but also the risks, and then go to the field and do a small study and then expand from there.
So am I hearing that there's a possibility where we could help with this, the geology side of the lab and how we help our clients currently, and then introduce the biology side to even further help clients who are interested in CCUS?
Yes, that's the whole point. It's not just helping, it's absolutely necessary. Because a company like us, we come at it from the biology angle, but we're not going to or be able to go build the whole infrastructure, say that a company like you guys have, right? And all the legacy and the knowledge of the subsurface. But the point here is to come together as an industry with the geology side, with the biology side, and understand how could we kind of find this overlap and what this could enable for us. And the best use case for that, which is a need absolutely right now, is CCUS, carbon capture and utilization. Because, if you're a CEO of an oil company right now, you're thinking about how can we reduce our carbon footprint? And there's some low-hanging fruits. Okay, we're going to use renewable sources of energy. Maybe we'll invest some in, wind and solar. And that's all great, but that's forward-looking. What we're saying is, what about all the billions and trillions of dollars that has already been spent on current assets, oil and gas assets? So that's the scope 2 emission, which is really hard to decarbonize. But by applying innovative ideas like this, turning the model on its head, because if you think about it, oil and gas industry, we know more than anybody else how to take one type of carbon and convert it to another type, right? And that goes the span of upstream and then downstream, right? And I think now is the time for us to kind of think through the model. Maybe there's opportunities for integration of upstream and downstream. Maybe some of these chemicals that we're making in downstream, we could make in the upstream by thinking differently about the reservoir as a reusable pore space that's available, not just to go there and say, let's go through, primary, secondary, tertiary, and just to get as much oil as we can out. But think about, this isn't subsurface facility. There is some oil there, we start there, and then once we get out the amount that is fine, what else can we do?
Yeah, and it's, again, in today's nomenclature and how we need to be more environmentally aware, looking at the reservoir as a renewable resource itself, it's kind of funny. It makes me think of Elon Musk. I'm listening to his one of the books about him, and the difference between his company SpaceX and his competitors is that he reuses rockets. Rockets used to get filled up,
right,
sent into space, and then discarded. What if you can reuse that rocket?
Yes.
It reduces your costs, and that's inherently great as a CEO to be able to lower your costs, but you're actually helping the environment. And I think this is kind of similar with the reservoir. As an oil and gas industry, we can get that message out.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. Right now, our reservoirs it's not reusable. We go to this process, and then the last stage is plug and abandonment, which by itself is a huge cost.
And that word itself, abandonment, right?
Right. It's like move on to the next one, right?
Yeah.
But there is opportunities now and commercial pathways for reusing the reservoir. And that's the model that, I'm trying to like talk to more people to get the word out and see, this is a good time to think about it. And you could then couple that with decarbonization by injecting CO2 in the reservoir as the starting point as well.
Yeah, I think it's the perfect time. And on my side as a sales director here, my team, we're talking to all of our clients upstream, and we are hearing this time and time again while we sit down in front of them. They are starting up their carbon capture programs. Some are way ahead, some are just starting up. And our team is responding to them in kind. We're also seeing it in the media. It's becoming very popular, a very big buzzword. So I think your company has a lot of, there's a lot of hope for what you're doing. And I think you're positioning yourself right. I think it's a great idea. How much time do we have left? Roughly, we're about 10 minutes or so, about 10 minutes. Let's talk about something other than just good old geology and biology. I have you here. I don't want to waste your time. You're the CEO of Cemvita Factory. We kind of mentioned it with Elon. What are some of the other things you've been doing? I know you've somewhat touched Elon and reached out to him in carbon capture in a sense. Maybe you can talk to that.
Sure. Yeah. So just to summarize that quickly, when we started this company, part of the fascination with the space was because we realized the space industry has thought about CO2 as a resource for a long time. Because both on the International Space Station, you have astronauts breathing out CO2 1 kilogram per day per person. So you have 6 people, that adds up quickly, right? Yeah. And with the space, it's always about what they call in situ resource utilization, meaning what can we make with what we have right here?
You only got this.
Yeah.
So you better be able to do something with
exactly. And instead of having to bring things with you. And because of this Mars program, there's a lot of discussion, how could we establish a settlement on Mars without needing to bring everything with us from Earth? So thinking about regenerative systems, right? And that's also, by the way, part of the reason that, there's not a lot of momentum for establishing a settlement on Moon because there's no carbon. But on Mars, with this 96% of CO2 being CO2, you could make a lot of things with that. Anything from fuels, which they're already doing through the propellant plants, through this reaction called Sabatier. You could actually convert the CO2 and the water into methane to use as the fuel for the way back.
Right, to refuel the rockets.
Right, because if you were to not do that, you have to burn more than 200 pounds of fuel to deliver 1 pound of fuel on Mars. It does not make sense.
It's a 200 to 1 type of 200 pounds of fuel.
You have to burn to deliver 1 pound of fuel on Mars.
Wow.
So and then the cost of just having the weight, right? So this gives them that kind of regeneration. Then the next step is, okay, how are we going to survive there once we got there? What about the food? What about the nutrients and pharmaceutics? And biomanufacturing is one solution because you could use the same CO2, mimic a process like photosynthesis, go from CO2 and water to glucose, which is the molecule of life, and then you could use that glucose as a building block to make other more complex nutrients, like amino acids, fatty acids, proteins even. And by the way, this is not rocket science. This is already being done. Like if you go to GNC, a lot of the products that you're going to buy are made this way.
And microgreens, right? And all of that as well, like the benefit of that. So I just had this funny thought. Did you see that movie with Matt Damon, Mars?
Yes.
And he's in the greenhouse.
Yes, yeah.
Is that kind of what your lab would help with on Mars?
Yeah, so it's a lot of the same concept, right? Using what's available right there. Now, in that case, like growing potatoes, and there's ways to there's a lot of research done on that, like how to, help, different type of vegetables grow in the space effectively. There's genetic engineering that's done for them to adapt to the different gravity and different, environmental sources, replicating that on Earth. But what we're saying is also to mimic this natural processes so that humans could engineer it and they could scale it and it would repeat what it's supposed to do over and over and over. So that's what this nature-inspired aspect of this comes in, to replicate those natural systems, but in a way that is engineered.
So that is actively what your company, one area that your company is still spending time researching and pushing for, correct?
Yes.
And have you talked with Elon and SpaceX about this? Where are you literally in space on this topic?
So I don't know if I could disclose like a lot of details about
I like it. You can't disclose it. It's very secretive. That's great.
But at the end of the day, for SpaceX or NASA or other companies to survive on Mars and have this plan for nutrients, they have to implement a solution, a variation of the same solution. Mm-hmm. So what we've done, we finished a phase 1 study with a private space agency where we successfully converted CO2 to glucose. And that was a big deal. And then the next step is to do that, test it on the International Space Station under microgravity environment, because you have to redo the whole system, right? Because things are not going to flow. You have to add pumps and the whole thing. And then the next step is to think about replicating kind of the simulation for Mars, and de-risk that. Okay. For us, it's actually a small project in the grand scheme of everything else that we're doing. The big problem, of course, is here on Earth with climate change, but we're learning a lot from space. And the reason for that is when you design systems for space, it has to be low energy. It has to be very, not very high volume, high footprint. It has to be not needing a lot of maintenance, And we're bringing that mentality into the way that we're designing systems for Earth, for being more efficient, more robust.
Okay, cool. Hey, we ran out of time now. We could talk for 4 hours on this. I really want to thank you for coming. And I just want to tell the people that are watching, specifically on carbon capture, utilization and storage, we're going to have a couple more podcasts, and we'll probably invite you again to talk with some of our experts and maybe get more into that biology, geology question subsurface, if you're willing to do that. But until then, thank you very much for coming. And maybe you can tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you, where to go, what's your website, etc. Yeah,
so I'm a millennial. You could easily get a hold of me on LinkedIn and Twitter, or go to our website, cemvitafactory.com, and just like send us an email. Happy to be connected.
Awesome. So again, thanks for watching this episode of Crude Talk, and until next time.
Thank you.